October 25th, 2016, Dead by Daylight introduced its very first licensed chapter, including Michael Myers, Laurie Strode, and new map Haddonfield. At this point in time, Dead by Daylight isn't as stressful as it is now. It's just a game where you can log in, scare your friends, and mess about, so the map wasn't really complained about. Fast forward 5, almost 6 years, and Dead by Daylight is a much larger game with over 50 new characters, toxicity, and dead hard galore. With everyone doing whatever it takes to win, it was quickly realized how survivors' side at Haddonfield was. The map was riddled with infinites and loops that survivors could take advantage of. The devs took notice instantly and realized Haddonfield needed a rework to be more balanced while also keeping the same theme. March of 2022, the rework for Haddonfield gets released, and in order to keep the theme of the original map, led to some very interesting and unique loops. So I decided to go through most of Haddonfield's loops and rank them based on how loopable they are. I say most because there are a lot of random windows that aren't actually loops. And also, there's also a couple of loops that are very slightly different, but I grouped them together. I rank the loops on how well they are on their own and not their combo potential with other loops. Of course, all of these are based on experience plus opinion, so if you have a differing opinion, feel free to yell in the comments. I'm gonna start at the loop I think is the worst and work my way up. At the bottom of D tier, what I believe to be the worst loop that could still be considered a loop is the picnic table loop. These aren't the official names, I'm just coming up with random names that fit. This loop is so small that the killer can easily make it to the other side with a single lunge. The only way this loop's gonna work is if you're going against a killer who just installed the game. The loop's only saving grace is the fact that if you're running out of loops, it's a good way to make very little distance. But like I said, I'm not gonna judge it based on its combo potential, so as a single loop, it's easily the worst. Now we have the living room loop. Now this loop, you can only actually loop once. The only good thing is that most of the time there's a gen right in the living room, meaning that if the killer starts chasing while you're on a gen, you can easily vault the window and loop all the way back to the vault again. Now in order to loop it, you have to run all the way around the house to the front, which by that time the killer can easily catch up, and you're better off just leaving to the next loop. Next, at the top of D tier, is the Hedge Loop. Now, most people don't actually run this properly from what I see and end up dying, but if you know what you're doing, it's not actually all that bad. Now, yes, it's still bad, but if you know what you're doing, it's still usable. The only way to loop this is if the pallet is still up, because once it's thrown, the killer can easily just mind game it. But if you run around the side with the wheelbarrow, what happens is that the killer either gets stuck on it or they're forced to take a wide turn around it that survivors don't have to take. Now, if you're going against a good killer or a ranged killer, you're better off with safer loops, but against an M1 killer, it's manageable. Bottom of C tier, we have the open shed loop. Now, this loop's interesting as it has the only breakable wall in Haddonfield, and if it didn't have that breakable wall, it would be an easy S tier. But once the wall's gone, the loop's destroyed and easily becomes one of the worst in the game. But I put it in C tier because you can usually loop it once or twice before the wall gets broken. Next we have the bedroom loop, and this loop may be a questionable choice and an argument can be easily made on why it should be D tier, but in the right situation it can be a good loop. This loop is only good if you're already upstairs at the start of the chase, a good head start to the window. The stagger after falling is the reason why most people get hit, but can easily be negated if you know what you're doing. What you want to do is if you know the killer will start chase with you, go to the doorway of the room where you can see the staircase, and once you see the killer, you could just go ahead and vault the window. Either the killer will go all the way back down through the front door, but with how big the front porch is, you'll have enough time to run to the back door. And if the killer starts vaulting, you'll be able to run through the front door all the way back up. The biggest mistake you can make at this loop is not knowing when to leave or just predicting what the killer's doing. It's best to wait at the corner of the front porch and wait to see what the killer does. Now we have the L loop. This loop is good against ranged killers due to the walls, but the walls also make this loop easily mind gameable. In order to loop this multiple times, the killer will most likely just create 50-50s until you drop the pallet or you die. There's nothing much else to this loop other than it's mostly luck based. Now the closed shed loop. This loop is basically ran the same as the L loop, but the reason I put this one higher is because the loop is in a square shape and is much bigger. Most of the time, you can camp the opposite corner that the killer's in and wait for them to move, and you can run accordingly. Now, the killer can mind game this loop, but it's harder, and if you run through the pallet and the killer's close behind, where you can't make it around the shed, there is a workbench on the other side of the pallet that allows you to quickly loop back around. Starting off B tier, we have the cop car loop. This loop has two variations, with the one having two cars that form sort of a triangle shape, but despite it making the loop much longer, I'm grouping the two together. This loop is just a simple loop. All you have to do is run around the car, and if it's a ranged killer, you can crouch behind the car and you should be good. The reason I put this in low B tier is because after the pallet is dropped, there's a short obstacle on the other side of the pallet that lets the killer easily catch up. For high B tier, we have the car loop. There's many variations of this loop that are all basically the same. This is just your average loop that anyone should be able to run, nothing much else to say about it. Other than once the pallet is dropped, if the killer decides to stupidly try and bloodlust you, take advantage of it. The loop is impossible for the killer to run without breaking the pallet. Run this loop in mind that the killer will most likely have to break the pallet instantly, letting you gain massive distance. Starting off A tier, we have the front porch loop. Before you all disagree, let me explain. This loop may just look like a 50-50, but because of how long the porch is, you can actually tell when the killer's at the point of no return, and when you vault the window, you'll gain massive distance. Even if the killer double backs, you can just go to the back of the house and gain distance anyway. But if the killer vaults the window, as long as he doesn't have anything that makes vaulting faster, you could just make it all the way back around. Middle A tier, we have the car hedge loop. This loop is just a combination of the cop car loop and the car loop. You have the car loop that's perfect for running around, and if you run past the pallet with no time to get around the car, you could just go around the hedge. The hedge is much bigger than the pile of trash or whatever is in the cop car loop, making it loopable, but it's not too big, so that provides a safe bet to go around if the killer's too close. Top of A tier, we have the garden loop. I debate putting this in S tier, but the fact that range killers can easily counter this makes it A tier for me. Now, this loop is impossible to mind game. It's so long where even if the killer makes you double back a bit, you still have plenty of time to make it all the way around. If the walls were taller, you could hide behind them, which would make it an easy contender for first plays, but now it is high A tier for me. Beginning S tier, we have the basement loop. The pallet in this loop is basically a god pallet in my opinion because of how strong it is. This loop is almost impossible to mind game, and the moment the pallet drops, you're as safe as one could be until the pallet breaks. No matter what the killer does, as long as you somewhat know what you're doing, it's definitely one of the best on Haddonfield. Now, I know I said I'm not including loop's combo potential, but come on, these two windows were literally made for each other. The middle of S tier, we have the Myers house loop. This loop definitely needs skill to use, but if you can get all the fast vaults, you'll be set and the killer will likely just leave you. This loop only works if you're starting on the front porch, fast vault inside, and then run to the back to fast vault the back porch window. If done properly, you can get all the way back around to the front porch to rinse and repeat. Now for the loop that I feel is the best in the map, the double window loop. This loop has different variations depending on which house it spawns in, but they all follow the same concept. This loop is hard to master, but I feel someone who has perfected this loop can turn it into an infinite. The way to run this loop is to enter the building, go to the opposite end of where you started from, and vault that window. You have to keep your camera in a way where you can see into the window and whether the killer is following you or not. Once you see what the killer is doing, you can make your decision accordingly. If you see the killer following you to either vault the window you just vaulted or go through the door, then run back to the way you came from and then repeat. But if the killer double backs and tries to mind game you, which you'll be able to see through the window, just go through the door that's right next to you and then do the same thing you were just doing, but the opposite direction now. Because the building's higher up than the outside ground, it makes it hard to see inside what the killer is doing, which can cause people to panic and make mistakes. But if you know what you're doing at this loop, I feel it's the best. And on top of all that, this is more of a personal thing, but I find this loop to be extremely fun compared to most loops, which doesn't really affect the fact that I think it's the best loop, but more of a bonus. If you're still here, thanks for watching. In order to make this video, I had to play Haddonfield over 30 times in a row, all of which happened within the span of like 3 days. So for 3 days straight, I did nothing but play on Haddonfield. No matter how much you like a map, that's a little excessive, so if you liked, please subscribe, and also let me know if I should do loops on other maps as well. Till next time, goodbye.